for joining us this morning. My name is Nicole Leggett. I'm the Executive Director of the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence in the WA Department of Communities. And this is a tender briefing for an update to Western Australia's Family and Domestic Violence Common Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework. So I suppose just to start with a little bit of housekeeping, this presentation is being recorded. We will also be taking questions and providing written answers to your questions. Although I will answer them in this briefing, we'll provide written answers as an addendum on Tenders WA, because there's actually a delay in getting the full recording up on Tenders WA. So to manage a gap in the middle, we'll provide written answers to questions as well. So perhaps what I can say at the outset is that I'm going to run through a series of slides and information about the tender request. Please post questions in the chat and I'll attend to all of them at the end. As I've said, we are recording the briefing. This will be made available in full on Tenders WA, but there is a lag. So your questions will provide written answers to, which we'll post as an addendum on Tenders WA more expediently. So Rachel, can I get you to move to the next slide, please? Oh no, I'm doing the slides. That's embarrassing. I'm joining you today from Borlu on Wajak Noongar Budja, and I'd like to extend and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you are all joining me on from today, which I understand is all over Western Australia and in some cases on the eastern states. So as I said, the purpose of this briefing today is really just to offer some information, which is largely in the request for tender around this project, but more specifically to provide an opportunity for question and answer so that you can get some early clarification to any questions that you have about what we're trying to achieve with this project and the processes that we are proposing in respect of the activities and deliverables for the project. So I'll run through a series of slides, but there will be time for question and answer. Please post your questions in the chat and I'll attend to them all at the end. So to offer you a little bit of background and context, between September of last year and March of this year, the government convened a family and domestic violence task force, and the task force was largely brought together in response to calls from the sector and lived experience advocates about essentially needing to do much better in our responses to family and domestic violence. The specific role of the task force included looking at service systems and how those systems respond to people who are experiencing and using violence. And the terminology around systems is intended to be inclusive of all government agencies that have service delivery responsibilities, all non-government organisations that have service delivery responsibilities, and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. So one of the key outcomes of the task force was a family and domestic violence system reform plan. And that system reform plan includes 17 actions across 4 areas, being workforce development, risk assessment, risk management, and information sharing. And the project that we are talking about today is one of the distinct actions within the risk assessment pillar in the system reform plan. And to my mind, in many respects, is one of the most important actions in the system reform plan, because it is essentially about setting a foundation for practice for how the whole service system responds to family and domestic violence. Sorry, I've just got a delay on my slides. Okay. So in Western Australia, we've had a common risk assessment and risk management framework actually since 2011. It was reviewed and updated in 2015. But as a framework, what it does or what it is intended to do is to set a minimum standard of practice for identifying family and domestic violence and assessing, managing and monitoring risk. What we know is that it's been a long passage of time since we last revisited this framework. We undertook a review in 2023, and through that process of review, identified a number of limitations around the framework as it currently is. And a range of those limitations relate to its kind of implementation status and the way that it's used in community. But also we know it's not contemporary to current state environment. It's not contemporary to the different types of services that we have available in Western Australia. It's not contemporary to legislation, and it's within that, it's not contemporary to current practice around things like information sharing. So it needs an update to make it relevant for Western Australia, but it also needs an update to be looking at and understanding the range of things that have moved on in the world and the family violence world since 2015, which will help us get to a place of having a much stronger and more robust framework. And within that is looking at developments in other jurisdictions, and particularly Victoria, who have invested significantly in their equivalent framework. Another action, which is part of the system reform plan, which is highly interrelated for this work and is a project that is currently advertised on Tenders WA as well, is development of an Aboriginal family violence risk assessment tool. And the intention is that we will redevelop the common risk assessment and risk management framework, which will provide that sort of broad-based standard of practice for family and domestic violence, but that we will have a complementary dedicated risk assessment tool and associated practice guidance around Aboriginal family violence. And that's really about recognising the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people as victim survivors of family violence, but also about understanding and recognising that that there are very unique considerations around strengths, protection, risk and vulnerability for Aboriginal people, and very unique considerations around ways to engage. And that's the intention about having some very dedicated and specific guidance. My apologies, I'm having a bit of a, here we go, okay. So the request for tender. So we are seeking to engage a consultant to produce an updated and contemporised common risk assessment and risk management framework, including update to the framework document itself. And for anyone who's had an opportunity to have a look at it, you'll see that it is a written framework that speaks to context, practice standards and practice guidance, as well as having embedded tools and other resources. So we're looking for it all to be redeveloped. The governance that sits around this work includes that the Department of Communities is the lead agency or the lead contractor. We are essentially the ones that will manage the consultancy contract. But the framework itself has implication for many government agencies and many non-government organisations, including Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. So we will be supporting the convening of a working group which has wide-ranging representation across those various sectors, so that the consultant can be continually checking and testing and refining with a group of people that are bringing all those different views to the table. I guess the other thing that I should mention in this space is that the all of the reform actions in the system reform plan are oversighted by an implementation oversight group, which has high level representation across government and also in the community services sector and Aboriginal community controlled organisations. So there's a central body that is oversighting everything and making sure that we meet all of our delivery timeframes. So in respect of the activities that we are looking for, we are looking for a consultant that will take consideration of the review of the common risk assessment and risk management framework that we've already done, that was completed earlier this year, as well as consideration of other contemporary research and evidence to essentially inform a project plan for how they intend to approach this work. And the reason why we've scoped the first activity as being a project plan is because although we've defined activities and deliverables, we think it's important that there's a space in the middle for collaboration about how the project actually goes, and that we bring stakeholders along in that and bring views to the table about what's the best way to approach this work, what's the best way to support engagement, what's the best way to pilot tools. The key activities include, as a priority, stakeholder engagement, really to draft, test and refine a common definition of risk for practitioners working across the response continuum, including those working with children and young people, people using violence and priority population groups. And part of that definition of risk needs to be inclusive of thinking about risk thresholds and also understanding that risk isn't static, it's dynamic and it changes. But currently in Western Australia, we have certain responses to family violence that are triggered by certain risk thresholds. So it's very important that we have some clear parameters and definition around that. Also, in respect of stakeholder engagement, we would expect that the consultant is designing the tools. So a screening tool, an assessment tool, tools and resources around risk management, which would be inclusive of referral processes and safety planning. And I guess the other part of all of this is about the information sharing. So we would expect that that design process occurs hand in hand with stakeholders, and that they're also engaging stakeholders around the framework document itself, so the policy piece. We would be expecting that along the way, the consultant will be formulating advice and recommendations for the working group about how the redesign takes shape and the things that should be considered or included. And we'll also be looking to the consultant to make sure and support alignment with other critical activities, including that Aboriginal family violence risk assessment tool. The deliverables for this project will include a project plan, which I've alluded to earlier, a design, validation and testing process with practitioners on the tools. And I also just want to make a comment about our language here. We've used the term validation, but we are not expecting development of a psychometric tool that is validated or have tests around its reliability in that same way that a psychometric tool is. The intent around use of the term validation is really practitioner-based evidence and practitioner-based testing. Obviously, the key deliverable is an updated version of the Common Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework. And we would also like a final report which speaks to the gaps that were identified and how they were attended to in the redevelopment of the framework. And if we land on a scope for the framework that isn't inclusive of all of the things that were identified through the stakeholder consultation process, it would be good to have those things identified as potentials for consideration in the future, including for implementation. So now I'm going to speak a little bit to the procurement process, unless I have Simon Doyle online. So Simon, can you shout out if you're online? Because I actually can't see any of the participants. Doesn't seem like we've got Simon, so I'll roll through this. So you must all be registered on Tenders WA to have received this information. But, just to state the obvious, registration on Tenders WA is essential for submitting for this request. We need everyone to complete, if you are submitting, you need to complete the request form. You need to answer all of the Part B content requirements. And this particular request is closing on the 10th of July at 2:30. I will take questions now, but also happy for, if you have other questions or clarifications that you think of as you're working through the response, there is an avenue to ask those questions, and that is through Simon Doyle, who is the email address that's listed on this screen. You can direct questions to Simon at any time in the period of time that the request is open. I guess just be mindful that to maintain a fair and transparent process, the answer to your question will be in a written form, and that question and the written answer will be posted as an addendum on Tenders WA so that it can be made available to everyone who's considering providing a response. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can have a look at the questions that have been posted, and we'll attend to those. Okay. So if you can post your questions in the chat, please, that would be great. So I'm just going to work through them from the top. Lots of hellos, which is very kind. So first question, if there are two separate consultants developing the CRARMF and the Aboriginal Family Violence Risk Assessment tool, what is the expectation around the two consultants working together to ensure that they are complementary? Is there some specific coordination of this outside of the general stakeholder engagement? So great question. Yes, it is absolutely our expectation that the two consultants will work together, at least on some level. And we can help put the stipulations and the parameters around that. It's not expected that they need to be totally integrated, but we need to be careful about how we're approaching consultation in particular in a way that is very clear for the sector about what each of those projects is doing and what the particular scope of engagement is, so that people have an understanding of what they're feeding into for what purpose and for what project. So we, through the working group, which will hold both of these projects, will be looking to put the parameters around that and also manage that in more of a real-time way. I should also say that the redevelopment of the Common Risk Assessment Framework is on a slightly different timeline than the Aboriginal Family Violence Risk Assessment tool, being that the Common Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework has a shorter timeline. So, and being the foundation piece, I think that will provide a neat stepping off point for some of the work around the Aboriginal Family Violence Risk Assessment tool as well. So the second question is a process question seeking confirmation that the deadline has been moved from the 3rd of July to the 10th of July, and I can confirm that that is correct. So the next question is, will the screening tool be inclusive of assessing for the risk of sexual violence and child sexual abuse, given these issues often coexist in family and domestic violence? It is a great question, and I think the answer is yes, but. And I say but because I think we need to do that engagement and design work to put the parameters around it. So where does it begin and end as an identification process, as opposed to screening and assessment around response? So and understanding that particularly in the child sexual abuse space at the moment, there's quite a lot of work being led nationally and by states and territories around practice standards and practice guidance around identifying and responding to child sexual abuse. So I guess I just want to be mindful that we're not stepping into a space that has an existing base of practice direction. So next question is, how does this body of work connect with and inform implementation planning? Again, a great question. So this project is largely about the redevelopment, but we would expect that in the engagement process, there will be a lot learned, and certainly already has been a lot learned in the review about how we approach the implementation. So we will be looking to capture and document and take that information as it comes to inform the implementation piece, which will be a separate project. So from a cost point of view and a scope point of view, this project is about the redevelopment. Implementation will be separate and not the remit of the consultant. So the next question is also a great question. It is really about validity and reliability. So while the Common Risk Assessment and Risk Management Framework isn't intended to have a psychometric risk assessment tool, would reliability in this context still mean that different people completing an assessment should arrive at a similar result threshold? I think the answer to that question is yes. Given that the practice approach that we currently use around risk assessment is an application of professional judgment, which is informed by evidence-based risk indicators, some of that guidance that we put around it will be important for helping support people to get to those same threshold decisions about risk. Because largely what we actually ask people to do currently, and it may be that in the course of this we take a slightly different approach, but largely what we currently do is say to people, these are evidence-based indicators of risk and high risk in circumstances of family and domestic violence. But in each individual case, there are other risk and vulnerability factors that are unique and specific to that person that you also need to take into consideration. So it's just a bit of a balance around what becomes, it's not just about the way people tick boxes, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. It's about building that depth of practice and knowledge so that people can take into consideration people's individual and unique circumstances as well. So the next question is, can I advise about how we are able to access the 2023 review? And I'll just look to get confirmation from one of my colleagues that we have published a summary of the review on Tenders WA, and then the successful consultant will have access to the full report. And in fact, we're working through that process of making the full report available as well, so that it is the informing piece for our stakeholder engagement.
That is correct, Nicole. The summary is on Tenders WA and it's downloadable.
Thanks, Tam. So the next question, I actually might have to take on notice. It says, we are based in Victoria, but also work in WA. Are interstate consultants considered under WA procurement rules for this tender? My answer to that instinctively is yes, but I will just double check and confirm that there's not something that I'm not aware of. So when we post the written response to these questions on Tenders WA, we will attend to that question and give that clear answer. So project timeframe. So within our request for tender, the project term is 30 June 2025, so 12 months or 11 months by the time we award. But we are asking for delivery of the framework and the tools by the end of the calendar year. So the reason why we've created a longer project term than the delivery is so that we've got, I suppose, a buffer that we can keep iterating and developing as we need to past 30 December. The other part that can come later is the final report that provides that more fulsome feedback around stakeholder engagement and issues and gaps and sort of informing thinking for implementation. So the next one is, I presume that we would need to give consideration to the downstream impacts of the risk assessment tool when developing the tool, e.g. service capacity constraints and demand. So thank you for the question. I think it is relevant, but it's not strictly within the remit of the consultant. And I expect that what will happen in the engagement process is we'll learn a lot about what's required to actually do the practice that we're asking for, which then we take a learning about from implementation and the resourcing required for implementation. So we're not asking the consultants to map out an implementation process or to cost an implementation process, but I think that there'll be learnings that are inherent in the piloting and the design that will be good to capture, that we will use for that implementation planning piece. So 6 months is a tight time frame for the initial body of work. To what extent will the need for sufficient resourcing be considered in the tender evaluations? So the budget for this project is $200,000, which I think is posted in the request. 6 months is a tight time frame, but we're building on a body of work that already exists. We've already done the review work. We've already got a very solid and strong framework that we can look to in Victoria's model and equally in Queensland, who've recently redeveloped the framework. And, you know, we've got the bones around WA's framework, not to say it doesn't need to be redeveloped. The other reason why the time frame is so short on this one is because common risk assessment sets the foundation for virtually everything else in the system reform plan. And for us to build out all of those other things, including workforce capability framework, workforce entity, literally everything else, we need to have a really clear understanding of what our risk assessment process and approach is going to be. And that's why we want to have an ambitious timeframe on completion. Great question. So is the intention for the stakeholder working group to include people with lived experience to test and validate the framework? So the government is currently considering a model for a lived experience advisory group, and my expectation is that that will be stood up within the timeframe for this project. And so that will be a reference point that the consultant will be able to use and have access to talk about this project and potentially test concepts and ideas. I guess, though, outside of that, I think that sort of engagement with lived experience, and particularly from that point of view of piloting tools, is critically important. And while we may not have lived experience representatives on the working group, I think the working group would have a role in facilitating access to people with lived experience that we could build into the piloting process for these tools and the framework overall. I'll just pause for a couple of minutes while we wait for any further questions to come through. I do note that we are at 11:30, but I'm happy just to wait a minute or two. So perhaps what I'll just do is reiterate some of the comments that I made earlier, which is that we'll be happy to take questions offline. So those questions can be directed to Simon Doyle, whose email address is listed in the request for tender, and then we will get an answer to you as quickly as possible and post a copy of that question and answer on Tenders WA. Thank you for your time this morning. It's actually wonderful to see such a great response. We're very excited about this piece of work. It's so overdue for Western Australia, and it's so important for our reform program overall. So we're really excited to see that so many people are interested in it, and we're very keen to see that it helps take us in the right direction in WA in terms of strengthening our responses to family and domestic violence. So thank you very much for your time. Please don't hesitate to ask questions as they come up, and we'll look forward to reading your responses when they come.